Hello, welcome to the first real-time webinar organized by Warsaw-based Center for Social and Economic Research and Why Emerging Europe, the biggest platform promoting business opportunities in Central and Eastern Europe. Today we're going to talk about political economy in Ukraine, and we have three experts with us. Anders Aslund, Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics and Chairman of the Case Advisory Council. Oleg Havrilishin, a professor at Toronto University at the Joint Vienna Institute and Case Fellow, and Christopher Hartwell, President of Case. My name is Andrew Robel, and I'm Head of Content at Why Emerging Europe. Now, the geopolitical situation in Ukraine has been a hot issue for quite a long while, and it has had an enormous economic consequence in the entire region. But before we talk about what's going to happen next, I would like to refer to today's event. Ukraine has signed a new agreement to buy Russian gas over the next 3 months. And the price is 25% lower than in the previous quarter. I would like to ask my guests how we should interpret that.
Well, if I may start on that, I would argue that this is entirely a defensive measure from Gazprom. Before this decision was made by Russia, Ukraine had decided not to import any gas from Russia from the 1st of April. And this is essentially the market price. So Gazprom creeps to the cross and accepts that there is a market price that it has to stick to. And while doing so, it tries to present it as some kind of benefit to Ukraine, which it is not. What Gazprom has done with regard to Ukraine is that it has lost its biggest customer by and large by mistreating Ukraine extraordinarily throughout the years. The main purpose of Gazprom in Ukraine has been to spread corruption, and through that corruption buy political power in Ukraine. And it has functioned like this, that some people, oligarchs close to Moscow, have been allowed to buy gas from Russia cheaply and then sell it at a much higher price in Ukraine. They have enriched themselves, but with that money they have also bought political power in Ukraine. The best Ukraine can do is to stop buying gas altogether from Russia, and Ukraine is now saving gas extraordinarily, partly because of the recession. And indeed, yesterday, Ukraine increased the gas prices for households by 330%. This is the right way to do it. Buy the little gas Ukraine needs extra from Europe and not from Russia.
Would you like to add, Chris?
No, I agree. I think one of the things that we talk about Russia as having this kind of petro power, whether it's through gas, it's through oil. But really, if no one's buying the gas, if no one's buying the oil, they're kind of an impotent hegemon. I really don't see how. And I like Anders' his kind of assertion here that this is kind of a face-saving move from Gazprom. I think that's very important to think about. We tend to think about Gazprom as also being this omnipotent power, but really it has killed the golden goose in Ukraine, and now it's really seeing what it can do on maybe for Easter to kind of resurrect it, if even just a little bit. And I think this is a face-saving move, but it doesn't say anything about kind of the broader geopolitical implications. I think this is a gas deal, and this is because of Gazprom. This is kind of isolated from everything else that's going on.
And what do you expect Putin's next steps about Ukraine will be? This is a more general question.
To me, I would argue that Putin will continue and try to make Ukraine fail. I see the main cause for Putin's military aggression into general aggression, that he wants Ukraine to fail, to show that democracy is no good for an East Slavic country. I see this as a preemptive strike against democracy in Russia. That's what he's really afraid of. And Putin has found many means to do so. Basically, they have wasted the gas weapon, so that is the least dangerous. What everybody is now discussing is whether we will see a military offensive around Mariupol, a big battle of Mariupol, which would be extremely damaging to Ukraine. If that will happen within the next month or month and a half, well, Russia still has sufficient resources to do so. And then we have the financial sector, where Russia is complicating the financing of the IMF package for Ukraine. So military and financial, these are that I'm particularly look up on.
Oleg?
Yeah, Mark Twain once said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I will try to say that Putin is going to do a little bit of all of these things that Anders has mentioned. His main goal is not necessarily territorial acquisition for its own sake, although there is value to that, especially in domestic nationalist politics, but it is to unsettle Ukraine and make Ukraine's ability to implement its democratic Euromaidan revolution and its move towards Europe a failure. And any tool that he can use to do this he's going to be trying. So it's difficult to know which of these is next. And indeed, maybe the first thing after the short period of a bit of a peace and ceasefire is precisely the gas, and that's supposed to unsettle Ukraine by playing the old little fishing rod game of 25 years to keep making it easy when it gets difficult, so that Ukraine stays on the line. This is likely also, in a paradoxical way, to feed the populism that is rampant in Ukraine against such things as gas price increase. Oh, look, the Russians are giving us a lower price. Why do we have to bother with these things? Let's stick where we are. But there may be, or there are likely to be, efforts at all sorts of activities, including military ones.
Chris?
No, I think what everyone has said is correct. I mean, obviously, Putin has kind of backed himself into a corner, obviously economically, but especially politically, with the move in Ukraine. Anders was exactly right that he cannot really portray, after calling the regime change in Kiev for the past year, these are neo-Nazis. How can we deal with neo-Nazis now? He's painted himself rhetorically into a corner. He doesn't care. This is what he wants. It's kind of the old Soviet worry about capitalist encirclement, that you need to have this kind of cushion, this buffer around Mother Russia, or in the old days, the Soviet Union, to make sure that Mother Russia stayed safe. There really isn't the kind of strategic, there definitely isn't the economic thinking in Russia that a strong Ukraine on Russia's western border is good for Russia. No, there's only this kind of tactical thinking of what kind of advantage Russia can get to it. And there really, to come back to kind of this economics analysis as well, there is a great emphasis in Russia and Kremlin today on benefits, but absolutely nothing on costs and how they are arrayed against each other. We can either win in Ukraine or we cannot win in Ukraine, but at what cost? This is what's not going on, and this is why there's escalation. This is why Kremlinologists are coming back trying to figure out what's going on and what is it getting at. But there really is this kind of narrow-minded focus on destabilizing Ukraine because it'll be good for Russia. What's the alternative? I'm sorry, what's an alternative?
It's interesting what you said about the buffer. I recently, a few months ago, I spoke to Dr. Mohamed Zahur. He's the publisher of the Kiev Post and also the chairman and the owner of Eastil Group, and he said that in his opinion, Ukraine should not be related to either the European Union or to Russia. Do you think that this is an opinion that is shared by other oligarchs in Ukraine as well?
I wouldn't think so. I think that this is a non-starter. Amongst other things, was sort of the political position, strategic political position of Ukrainian governments of the past, and I think in retrospect, it's clearly a loser. Ukraine cannot be a Switzerland. Ukraine cannot be entirely neutral, neither in the military strategic sense nor in the economic sense. I mean, Ukraine's economy should be doing a lot of exchange with both the East and the West. Indeed, it had been, and in my view, before Putin's attacks, aggression, and moves to block Ukrainian exports to Russia, the balance of exports was probably about what you'd expect in a normal environment. He's upset that. Normality. I think that the long-term aim, but this will take a while, the long-term aim is not to move entirely towards Europe or move entirely away from both sides. The long-term aim is to be a natural trading country, open to all sides, and be trading with two big neighbors, a really big one, Europe, and a relatively big one, Russia, back to what it was, frankly, perhaps a year or two ago.
I can see that Chris is nodding. Do you agree?
Well, it's a silly question, I think, saying that Ukraine needs to stand alone from the EU. Ukraine needs to stand alone from Russia. Who is Ukraine? I mean, what was this? The national identity of Ukraine was already fragmented. Now Putin has really kind of created this national identity that was very evanescent, that was very amorphous beforehand. I mean, there are now Ukrainians, but what is, we talk about, we say Ukraine needs to look east, Ukraine needs to look west. It's about the people that live there. And to phrase the question that way is basically asking elites who have wrecked the economy of the country for 23 years and bitterly fought amongst themselves, telling them that they have to decide, or that elites in Brussels or that elites in Moscow have to decide. I think this just frames the question at such a God's eye view level that it really is also losing touch with what's going on in Ukraine. With what happened at Maidan was the dissatisfaction with with the elites, the way things have been going for 23 years. It wasn't we needed to stampede to Brussels. It was, we're dissatisfied with the way things are now. I think it just, again, this is more kind of this geopolitical playing at such a high level that we're really forgetting about the human factor, the economic factor, and the individual here.
Let me add a couple of perspectives here. What Russia really stands for today, it's corruption and security police. Karen Davisha, in her new book, Putin's Kleptocracy, shows what Putin's rule really is. It's the fusion of corruption and secret police. And this is how Russia tries to operate throughout the post-Soviet world, and not only. Say that 1/10 of the top people in Ukraine were previously KGB informers. Today the same people are mostly there, and today they work not for Ukrainian SBU, but they work for Russian FSB, the internal secret police, because Ukraine is not considered a foreign matter by the Russian security police. And this is what one wants to get away from. And you can also look up on the Eurasian Economic Union. What does it amount to? It is old standards, it's old Soviet standards that that union is maintaining. while the European Union has modern commercial standards. So it's a question, do you want to have a horse cart, or do you want to have a modern automotive vehicle? This is really the question. So Russia is no alternative. It is Kremlin control over Ukraine, or it is freedom. And you can also look up on what has happened in the 11 Central and East European countries that have become members of the European Union. In all of them, corruption has gone down. Corruption has got under control. Poland is a wonderful example on this. In Ukraine, corruption has stayed as bad as it was 10 years ago. There has been no improvement according to the measurements we have, and corruption is the biggest problem Ukraine has. Therefore, Ukraine has to turn to the West, and as both Oli and Chris said, the Ukrainian population are now overwhelmingly against corruption and in favor of the European Union. So this is really no choice. There is the odd person who might say something, but you can also see that most of the big Ukrainian businessmen are in favor of the European Union. Poroshenko himself, Viktor Pinchuk, Sergei Taruta, and also Rinat Akhmetov is mainly in favor of the European Union. I'm not sure about Kolomoisky's position. So this is the dominant position, not only among the population, but also among the elites. If you turn to the Yanukovych elite,
one question from go on.
Mm-hmm. I'm finished.
Okay, talking about corruption, we just got a question from one of our viewers. Ukraine ranks 142 out of 175 on the Transparency International list of most corrupt countries. How can the country build trustworthy institutions to keep unity and change the situation?
You need to start from the top. Sack all judges, sack all prosecutors, and processes are underway. Rely upon civil society. Ukraine today has probably the strongest civil society, but this takes time. It will be a fight. There will be
if I may add to that,
Sure.
If I may add to that, Andrew, I entirely agree. I think there needs to be a little bit of a shock therapy in a judicial way in Ukraine to teach the lesson that corruption is not acceptable. At the same time, and I believe Anders would not disagree, at the same time there have to be a much more substantial changes in structural issues in regulation, licensing, and so on, which, after all, are at the heart of the corruption. If you simplify licensing for businesses and so on, there are no bureaucrats in the extreme. There are no bureaucrats to bribe. That is being done, but too little, too slow. It really should be moving a lot faster to help as a second arm of the fight against corruption, the first one being what Anders mentioned.
Yeah, let me add here also that the new Minister of Economy, Ivar Samovicius, and the new Minister of Agriculture, Pavlenko, have done a lot of things in this regard, because agriculture had lots of regulations that have now been eased, and the Minister of Economy is responsible for most of the regulations. So big steps have already been taken in these regards.
We have another question from our viewers. Has the West changed their perception of how they need to help Ukraine following the events of the past several months, especially with respect to realizing that Putin and Russia do not tell the truth and that negotiations with Russia are impossible?
Well,
It's a tough one. To some extent, one does see the West express Western political leaders express positions and views in which they basically say, we don't believe a word that Mr. Putin is saying. At the same time, the actions they are taking on just how tough the sanctions are, I'm not saying they don't have any effect, but they're not given what Chris had said earlier about what Putin really cares about. They're not that important to him and the leaders. The West has been quite generous, so there's an attitudinal change. Despite a lot of complaining over the past year with the new government that reforms are not moving enough, they have been relatively generous with putting together a package. It's not there 100%, but it's substantial, and it's certainly closed the gap temporarily and bought Ukraine time to do its own adjustment. But of course, the outside of my own expertise, certainly. The main demand of Ukrainian leaders, Poroshenko and others, to the West is being ignored, and that is the question of armaments support to be able to provide a significant and plausible defense against a much more powerful Russian military. So there you have it. Where does that balance? Well, a most cynical way of looking at the Western attitudes here is that they're being more generous than they might otherwise be on the financial support as sort of a diversion from the fact that they are not providing the military support. That may be too cynical, but Ukraine is in a position where it has to be worried about both of these issues, the economic situation and the military situation at the same time.
Let me add here, I would not say that the West has been particularly generous. The IMF has stepped up, and of course the West is still in on the IMF board. But the United States is providing $2 billion only, and this is in low-quality loans. And the European Union is also only providing $2 billion for Ukraine this year. This year is the crunch period, and at the same time we are actually seeing China discussing altogether $20 billion of loans to Ukraine. So one wonders, doesn't the European Union in particular understand how important Ukraine is for Europe itself? I would have hoped for a much stronger support from the European Union in particular. And in that case, I also think that the US would provide more.
Yeah, if I could join this one and maybe go a little bit more, even more provocative, I would say that the West has been a mess when it comes to Ukraine. I think the West has always been a mess when it comes to Ukraine. Look at the George Bush the Elder's Chicken Kiev speech in 1991, and that everybody in the Soviet Union should kind of stay together because we don't know how to deal with it. I think we've been talking again about tactics, about how we support the Ukrainians in this kind of dignity revolution, how we can contribute via the IMF or towards government-to-government assistance. But again, there's no strategy. The sanctions are there. What are they going to accomplish? Are we driving the Russians out of Crimea? Are we stopping separatists and Russian tanks crossing the border in the east? Are we bringing to justice the murderers of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17? What is the goal of these sanctions? It hasn't been debated in the West. And if it has been debated, and I'm sorry, being based in Warsaw, I'm not sure if DC actually has a plan on this. How are we going to get to these goals? I think Putin, as we've spoken about, has a definite strategy in Ukraine. The West does not. We are just making, in the West, we're just making moves, we're making tactics, we're not really operating under a strategy. And this is the problem. And this is going to continue to be the problem, especially given the weakness of the US administration, given the disarray of the EU, and kind of confronting this issue. I don't think much has changed. To answer the original question, I don't think much has changed in the West.
And what about the last 6 months since the important agreement between the European Union and Ukraine has been in place? What has changed in your opinion?
Yeah, let me add a little more to this. I don't disagree with Anders that individually the U.S. and the EU have been very skimpy. They should have added more. But I see the everything together as a package. I mean, after all, the IMF is more or less guided by its major seven members, and it's not new in history that the big G7 use the IMF as a way of not putting in their own money directly. So we do see a repetition of that, and we'd like to see more. But let me emphasize that without, at this particular point, without an IMF agreement, things would have looked very dire in the macro terms. We already had a little burst of a crisis of confidence. So that is, if not generous, then certainly the right thing to have done. It's helpful. Strategy. Of course, there is no strategy for those of us who think we know what the end result is going to be. But that's not the way politics necessarily works. And frankly, yeah, there is a strategy. It's a very simple old aphorism of Churchill's: jaw is better than bang bang. They're doing absolutely everything they can to try to show the world that they are trying to stop the shooting in the Donbass. They're not being greatly successful at this because it continues to erupt. But if there is a strategy, that's the strategy. Is it a good strategy? No, of course not. And I think that's what Chris had in mind. It's a strategy of avoidance, a strategy of not getting into a potential conflict with Russia. The Russian bear has been feared for 300 years, and it continues to be feared. Is it justified? I mean, is Putin likely to cross the Polish and Estonian borders? Probably not, but one never knows. Let's just do everything to try to pacify him. And you don't hear the counter arguments that the way to pacify a bully is to stand up to him.
We just got a comment from another viewer, and it's suggestions of how to change the tone and send a strong, united message to Putin.
I think I just gave one suggestion. And I'm not the only one. Certainly we see, especially in Britain and America, a large number of officials, Congress people, politicians, and former officials saying that, look, the sanctions have gone as far as they can. We've got to show a little bit of firmness, and that is a new proposal.
Here in Washington, virtually everybody who's anybody supports the delivery of arms, defensive arms to Ukraine, and there's one person who's against it. It's President Obama. The question is if he will hold up and maintain it, given that he's very independent and stubborn. I fear that it will be the case, but both the Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense, and indeed, as Ollie mentioned, the congressional leaders are strongly in favor of arms for Ukraine. So this could change. I should add here on the Russian side. I think that Russia is now stretching its military resources to the end. Igor Suchagin of the Royal United Service Institute in London presented an excellent report recently claiming that 90,000 Russian soldiers are involved in the war in Ukraine, inside or outside of the territories. 12,000 Russian soldiers in Donbass itself. And it's also argued that Russia only has about 100,000 soldiers who can actually fight. So out of 650,000 altogether. The others are good for construction work and agricultural work, but not for military work. And Therefore, Russia probably cannot do much more now. So the question is if we will see an offensive against Mariupol within the next 1.5 months. And given that this is the situation, it's simply incomprehensible that the West is not delivering arms to Ukraine. And the cost here would be very small. Think of it, the Ukrainian GDP today is $80 billion. The Ukrainian defense expenditures of 5% of GDP planned for this year, that's $4 billion. What has been discussed here in a think tank report led by former Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot is $1 billion a year. That would be an enormous addition to the Ukrainian military effort. And after all, Ukraine claims now to have 60,000 troops in the east of the country. So Ukraine, President Poroshenko stated recently, has among the 5th largest military forces in Europe. And if you think of it, well, it's Russia, Britain, France. Who comes next? Certainly not Germany, certainly not Italy, nor Spain, perhaps Poland. Perhaps Ukraine has the 4th strongest military force in Europe today. Perhaps it's Poland, but Ukraine is up there. So the military struggle of Ukraine is not hopeless. After all, it has now, as we speak, been going on for almost a year. The Russian bear is not so strong. Remember that Finland held up against Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union in the Winter War of 39-40.
I would briefly like to come back to this idea of the European Union and the agreement. How do you see the economic situation inside Ukraine changing over the last half a year? I recently again heard a comment from the former Minister of Economic Development and Trade saying that basically Ukraine's investment potential is growing, and that has never been that good before, and what the government has done recently is really pro-business. Do you agree with that?
Let me start off on this one because it comes back to what we were saying before about institutional change, about structural change. Yes, I think that the government has done wonderful things over the past year in really just kind of removing the myriad of barriers that there were to investors, investor protection in Ukraine. And you can see from a kind of a growth standpoint that even the removal of these tiny barriers unleashes, just waves of entrepreneurship. There is still so much more to be done, though. I think one distinction to be made, is Ukraine pro-business. I think Ukraine's always been pro-business. I think Russia's pro-business. There's a difference between being pro-business and being pro-market. I think that's what Ukraine really needs when we're talking about kind of the therapy, is that it needs to be more pro-market. Investment will flow to Ukraine if it continues moving and moving rapidly towards these kind of institutional and structural changes. One of the biggest ones that I want to talk about is, we mentioned agriculture is now actually the top of the ranks for investment into Ukraine. It's got fantastic growth potential, but there still aren't actually property rights when it comes to agricultural land. There's still a land sale moratorium that keeps getting extended. It's supposed to run out this time by 2016, but it's still hanging on for the past 15 years, that you're not allowed to sell your land. You can't sell your agricultural land, then you can't have it collateralized. And people are still finding ways to get land, but they're extra legal. So without this kind of basic building block for investment, for a market economy, investment's only going to go so far, and then you're going to hit a plateau. Ukraine needs to continue to develop, needs to continue to be putting in place this institutional framework that it's been lacking. Ukraine today is probably the best that it's ever been, and hopefully Ukraine tomorrow will be even better, but it's still not where it needs to be.
Well, I think that this has been a big disappointment. Last year, Ukraine's export to the European Union increased by only 2.5%. And why so little? You can see it by the monthly development. It did very well during the first 10 months, and then it collapsed in November, December, because the agricultural quotas were filled. The EU still imposes very small agricultural quotas on Ukraine, and then you can't have much of an export, because agriculture is what is really taking off now, as Chris rightly said. And another factor is that Ukraine now has 35% inflation. This is because the exchange rate collapsed in February before the IMF money came. Ukraine was in a state of financial meltdown for 3 days, 23rd to 25th of February, and then you don't get any foreign investments at all. Ukraine last year did not get any foreign direct investment, and the foreign direct investment the serious one, will only come when the economy is stabilized and when the war is under control, and that is not yet the case. So the European Union is not opening its markets for Ukraine, and it can't really provide conditions for foreign direct investments now, nor can Ukraine, because this IMF program is seriously underfunded, and this is a very fragile situation.
Can I add a couple of thoughts to the EU prospects and perspective? I want to address instead of the question of what does Ukraine need to do to get the greatest benefits from that, what should Europe be doing? Anders just mentioned, for example, that agricultural quotas are still tight, even though there has been a little bit of opening up, and a lot more Ukrainian chickens are being exported to Europe than before. A lot more is still a drip in the bucket. From the European side, well, Europe has done one thing in the past year and a half that it should not be underestimated as a force to support Ukrainian attitudes and so on, and that is simply agreeing to sign the association agreement. Now that acts as a beacon of medium-term pulling of Ukraine towards the right sorts of things, but it is not yet being put into practice technically that much. Part of the problem is, of course, the conflict in the east. Investors are being kept away not only by uncertainty of things, say, on the land, such as land property rights and still incomplete structural reforms, but investors are being kept away by the uncertainty of the conflict in the east. But despite that conflict, there's a lot of opportunity in the western and central parts of Ukraine to do a lot more EU orientation. Two things that I think Europe can do that will add to the moral importance of a EU orientation plus the practical importance. One, Europe should agree to a visa-free regime, as Poroshenko has been asking for, as soon as possible. People in Poland in particular should be, I think, aware of the tremendous importance of, in the 80s, having such a large outflow of people to the West to see what the rest of the world looks like, and thereby being much more willing to support the very quick and harsh measures of the early Big Bang. That's needed more in Ukraine. Maybe there should be a special program to take people from the East and have them travel in Europe to see what a market economy looks like. The other thing that should be done is much more practical economically, and that is that Europe can provide a lot of assistance, financial, technical, and so forth, to help speed up the harmonization of phytosanitary requirements by Ukrainian exporters individually, for example. Once those things are done, then we will see a boomlet in exports, and hopefully a boomlet in foreign direct investment. I'm pretty sure, and Chris may contradict me or support me, I'm pretty sure that a lot of Polish industrialists are sitting there sniffing the winds and saying, look, our wages have shot up greatly. Look across the border. We have people who are basically as competent as our workers here in Poland at wages that are, let's say, approximately 1/4. Gee, isn't it time to start thinking to offshore from Poland to Ukraine? That will be a small boomlet, and hopefully we will see the same inflection in FDI curves in Ukraine come well before association is completed or even membership. It happened in Central Europe, the inflection in that FDI curve, not in 2004 or even 2000, but it happened in about 1995-96, well in advance, because foreign investors want to be the first on the ground once they feel secure that there is a return.
I have one final question now. Do you think it is likely that Russia will ever convince Ukraine to join the Eurasian Economic Union?
When the hinges of hell freeze over, to be blunt about it, that seems at this stage highly unlikely, not only because of how far things have gone in Ukraine, but because of the growing awareness to which I'll be immodest on my behalf, but not modest on behalf of my colleagues, to which my colleagues at the seminar have contributed a lot by their writings and statements about making Ukrainians more aware of what European association agreements and membership quests have meant, how the economy has improved over the period since 1989 because of that kind of orientation and because of market reforms.
Absolutely not. Russia today has seen its GDP fall from $2 trillion a year ago to now $1.2 trillion. Russia is today the 14th biggest economy in the world at current exchange rates. Russia is a deep crisis itself. It's not attractive from an economic point of view either.
Yeah, if I could just to finish up on this, Vox Ukraine had a great article today of what Ukraine would look like today if there weren't a Maidan revolution. Let's think about this Eurasian Economic Union idea. I've written before, I've spoken before on this, is that no one really has a sense of what it's supposed to be economically. We all know what it's supposed to be politically. It's Putin getting the gang back together. But in terms of its economics, it's built on old Soviet standards, as Anders said before. It really doesn't have raison d'etre for what it's going to accomplish. If Maidan had never happened, if Yanukovych were still in power, the whole raison d'etre for the Eurasian Economic Union would still be problematic. Russia was broken before it decided to invade eastern Ukraine. It had deep structural problems economically before any of this happened. So it would probably still be in recession, or would be at stagnation at the very least. So there would really not be the economic reason to get into a Eurasian Economic Union from Ukraine other than the politics. Now, the politics have shifted so far the other way that there's no economic reason, there's no political reason. The EU is dead. Long live the EU.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today. We had Anders Aslund, Oleg Havrilishin, and Chris Hartwell. We're going to be talking about Ukraine soon, I believe, because this is an important and large topic to discuss. But this is all for today. Thanks for joining us, and look for new webinars in the near future. Thank you.